Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video. I hope you're all well. As you can probably read from the title of this video, I will be sharing my experience of how I became an airline pilot. I know there's probably a lot of youngsters, aspiring pilots who are probably watching this video, and I think it will be a great way for me to share my path into aviation and how I became an airline pilot. And there's probably a lot of you guys that have just pressed this video because you're just fascinated to know the pathway in order to become a pilot. So I hope you guys enjoy. So from a young age, I always wanted to be a pilot, and one of the main reasons is because I've had a big family influence. So my uncle and cousin actually are pilots, and they fly for the National Airlines of Bangladesh, and I think they had a really big contributing factor in me wanting to become a pilot. My uncle used to come to London like once a month back in the day, and I would kind of always hear his fascinating stories of him travelling around the world, and it really interested me. In 2013, I was given the opportunity to visit the flight deck of a Boeing 777 in flight. It was an absolute amazing opportunity. I was absolutely fascinated by what I saw. The view outside was breathtaking. Like, where else can you get an office with such a beautiful view? For me, I think this was definitely like the turning point of me wanting to become a pilot, as I was just so invested by everything that was kind of going on there. I was just intrigued. So yeah, from a very small age, I always loved maths. Maths is still one of my favourite subjects. But when I was doing my GCSEs, I wasn't entirely sure of if I wanted to pursue my career in aviation. So I kept my doors open, and then for my A-levels, I also like sciences. So I actually took maths, bio, chem. But when I was 17, I started to do more research, and I decided to go on a trial flight for me to kind of know if I wanted to become a pilot. So for those of you that don't know what a trial flight is, a trial flight is basically when you're in the air for about 30 minutes to about an hour in a light aircraft, and you get to basically climb, descend, do some turns, and it's literally there just for you to have a bit of fun. I think this was an amazing experience as a 17-year-old, being in control of an aircraft. Not fully, of course, obviously I've got an instructor sitting next to me and he's helping me out. But I think it was just an amazing experience of being in control, and I think this was a stepping stone for me wanting to become a pilot. I think this was probably definitely one of my biggest highlights, as I actually had my first ever flying lesson before I had my first ever driving lesson. Now, for any youngster, I think you should definitely try and book a trial flight if you haven't already, just to see if you're ready and if you like flying, because you might, for example, get up in a plane and be in control, and you might not fancy it that much. And I think this will put you in good stead when it comes to your flight school interview one day, because they may ask you, have you had any aviation experience? And you can kind of bring this point along and say, yeah, I've had a trial flight, I've been in control of an aircraft, I really enjoy it, and I can definitely kind of see me doing it in the future. Looking back at things, the only one thing I probably regret that I didn't do is potentially air cadets. So a lot of my colleagues in flight school, they did air cadets, and I think air cadets is a really good way for you to build experience, as well as have an insight to aviation industry itself. And I think this will really look really promising when it's on your CV, when you're applying for these flight schools. And it obviously builds up your aviation experience as well. So after I'd kind of done this trial flight, I started doing more research into the different routes of becoming a pilot. So essentially, there's two routes. You've got the integrated and you've got the modular route. So I did the modular route, and this is just the route I did, but by no means is this the correct route, or if it is the best route. Make sure when you are doing your research that you look at the flight school which is best suited and catered towards you. So the integrated route is basically going from 0 to 100. It's basically going to full-time school and full-time education. And by at the end of you finishing flight school, you would become a commercial pilot. One of my main concerns when I was applying to these programs was understanding, do I need any prior aviation experience, or is it okay? And I found out the flight schools actually didn't require any prior aviation experience. It would have been a bonus, but what they're really looking to see is if you've got the motivation, if you've got the right attitude, if you've got the thrive to succeed and become a pilot. So the integrated route is approximately 18 months. So 6 months is ground school, and then you move on to the flight training side of things, where you do basic flight training, you do advanced flight training. At the end of that, you've got a UPRT, and then you've got your APS MCC, and then you walk away with a commercial pilot license. The modular route's a bit more different. So I've got a couple of friends that have gone down the modular route. The modular route may be for people that may not have all the funds for an integrated course, or for example they're studying or they're working and they're having to do half working and then half flying to build up their hours. By going down the modular route, it gives you the ability to, I guess, work and fly at the same time, and you obviously don't have to dedicate your entire time to an integrated course and to like a flight school from day 0 to the last day basically. This is the modular route is usually for people who go down the PPL route. So once you've got your PPL, and then obviously you come back to like a flight school, and you need to obviously like build up your hours. Then you need to complete like the 14 ATPL subjects, the syllabus. Then you need to do your CPO exam, and then you need to do your MEIR. So I then started doing more research into like different flight schools and what they each have to offer. So what I did was to find more about these flight schools was I attended the Pilot Careers Live in Heathrow. Now this is basically something I 100% recommend you to do, and this is basically where you can kind of get a taste of each flight school and what they can offer, and figure out what flight school is actually best for you. So at the Pilot Careers Live, what you have is all the different top flight schools in the UK and Europe, as well as some airliners, and they're basically at a stand, and you'll basically get to chat to the head of training, the head of flight training, cadets that are doing training right there, or former cadets who are now pilots, and you can basically find out what their flight school has to offer, why they think they're the best, and it's just for basically flight schools to kind of, for them to shine and let everyone know why they're the best and why they think you should join their flight school. So Pilot Careers Live doesn't only happen at Heathrow, it happens all around the UK, and I highly suggest you young, aspiring young pilots and aviators to definitely go to one of these days, so you can kind of get exposure of all these different flight schools and what they have to offer. But after that, I actually attended flight school open days. So obviously at the Pilot Careers Live, there was a lot of information, people telling me they offer this and that. But for the open day, it's actually visiting them themselves, seeing what they have to offer, seeing the infrastructure, seeing the ground school classes happen, seeing state-of-the-art simulators as well as the aircrafts. This is basically where the flight school is going to be on their best of behaviour, and they're just trying to kind of shine and excel and basically try and motivate and encourage you to kind of like join their flying school. But that's what I think you guys should do in order to find more about flight schools. So some schools will obviously stand out more than others. At the end of the day, it's your choice, and it's where you think you will kind of fit best. For example, it may be that you like at one flight school that they've got a very family environment, family atmosphere, everyone's really calm, relaxed, really personal feeling, because they're quite small compared to a big flight school. But then other big flight schools, you might like how they've got a high pass rate, all the success they've had across, I don't know, the last 20 years, for example. You might like their training facilities, their state-of-the-art simulators, some of the aircrafts they fly, or even, for example, the country that they conduct their flight training in. I remember like when I was looking at like New Zealand, because New Zealand is such a beautiful, amazing place to like complete your flight training. So this is where like L3 Harris was quite appealing to me. So at the end of the day, after I considered all these options, I actually decided that I wanted to go to L3 Harris. And this is because it's a world-renowned flying school, it's got a big reputation, good success rate, amazing facilities. Another thing that attracted me was, yes, as mentioned about New Zealand and it being amazing, but it's also how they had a holding pool. So obviously a holding pool is where after you've completed your training, all the pilots are basically placed in this pool, and then when airlines need to recruit, they come and choose select cadets that have met the right criteria. And this really appeals to me, how the flight school goes out above and beyond and tries to help you get a job. So this is why I thought L3 Harris would be the best fit for me. So while I was doing more research about L3 Harris, on their website I came across a very world-renowned airline that did a pilot program apprenticeship with L3 Harris. So this is basically, you do all your training with L3 Harris, and then you have a confirmed job with them at the end if you've met all their requirements. So as it was such a good airline, I decided to apply for them. Now, the selection process was very rigorous, and it consisted of multiple aptitude tests, a mental maths test, a numeracy test, a physics exam, as well as a group exercise and an interview. I went all the way until the final stage. However, I didn't pass the interview, and I was super gutted. I thought that this was my only hope in getting into aviation. Being 18 at the time, being fresh out of school, I didn't obviously have a lot of work experience and a lot of life examples. So when it came to the interview, I didn't have a lot of good quality customer facing examples that I could give. So I took the feedback from the airline and I decided to work at Stansted Airport for about 6 months. And by working at the airport for this amount of time, I was able to get a lot of life experience. I was able to be in an aviation setting, speak to pilots, speak to the ground staff, speak to dispatchers, and I was able to pick their brain. And it also made me mature as an 18-year-old, as I'd never worked previously, and this was just a great time to just soak up all this information and to learn about the aviation industry. For someone who is young, and if you're like an 18-year-old and you're watching this video and you don't have a lot of life experience, I suggest that you go down maybe like in a customer-facing environment, and if you can, maybe even work in the aviation industry, as this will be a bonus. You could, for example, work in like cabin crew, you can work in the operations department, or maybe work as a ground handler or a dispatcher, as this will put you in good stead when you are answering questions for your flight school interview, and you have some really good aviation examples as well. So I was super gutted that I didn't get into this big world-renowned airline, but I then ended up reapplying for L3 Harris and CAE, and I ended up getting into both of these flight schools, L3 and CAE, and I had to choose between the two. And as I mentioned before, like L3 Harris just had more things that were more appealing to me, so I ended up going to L3 Harris. If you haven't already seen my YouTube video on how to pass the selection process for different flight schools, you can click the link down below. I also offer one-to-one selection process advice and help, especially for the interview process. I do think there are a lot of 18-year-olds that don't have the right help. For example, they don't know how to maybe articulate themselves because they don't have a lot of life experience. So this is why I offer this selection process one-to-one sessions. I've also helped a lot of students so far get into different flight schools. For example, I've helped students get into L3 Harris, CAE, Leading Edge, Skyborne. I've also helped students get into the BA fully funded Speedbird pilot program, as well as the EasyJet program. So if you want to get in contact with me for selection process help, you can either email me or DM me. All my contact details are down below, and we can proceed ahead with availability. So finally, in April 2020, I started flight training with L3 Harris. However, due to the pandemic, I started ground school at home on Zoom. Now, I was having to learn subjects such as meteorology, aircraft general knowledge, as well as principles of flight at home. After completing this module, I was sent to Gatwick to continue the rest of ground school. I was in Gatwick for approximately 6 months. There was obviously a lot of hard work, a lot of revising, a lot of information having to be crammed in a very short amount of time. But we were always, all the students, like all the kids in my class, we always knew the end goal of like we want to become an airline pilot, and this is just hard work for a short amount of time. Now, after finished ground school, we were given the unfortunate news that flight training in New Zealand had actually closed, and that the New Zealand branch had shut down because New Zealand's Prime Minister had decided to close the borders. So yeah, we were obviously really gutted, and we joined L3 Harris, especially because of New Zealand. We had a bit of a delay, a 9-month delay. We then found out that we outsourced to Leading Edge in Oxford, which is another flight school. Obviously the main reason we were disappointed was obviously not doing training in New Zealand, and that's why we joined L3 Harris. But the second thing is, like, flight training in the UK is not the place to be, because there's obviously just such bad weather, and flight training would obviously get prolonged and it would take quite a long time to finish. But the main positive about me doing my flight training in the UK was I did all of my flight training in the UK airspace. The UK airspace is considered one of the most challenging, or if not the most challenging airspace in the whole world. And it also gave me good confidence on me practicing my RT, the radio telephony. So that's basically how you communicate with air traffic controllers. I think I had an actual advantage and lead compared to some of my other peers who did their flight training in for example, Portugal, and when they came back they found the RT quite difficult. So in that sense, I was pretty happy with that. So I started at Leading Edge in August 2021, and initially your first 12 flights is basically to get you ready for your 13th flight, which is your first solo. So in your first 12 flights, you basically start practicing basic flying skills, such as climbing, descending, turning, doing stalling practice, PFLs, steep turns, and circuit practice. These are all done to make sure that you are safe and you're ready for to be released for your first solo, and especially in case if anything was to go wrong and that you could handle the aircraft safely in a suitable manner. So your first solo is basically where you do a circuit and is where you fly for the first time without an instructor. So after you complete your first solo, you then move on to nav and landaway flights, where you go to different airports and you land there. After you do this, you have a mini progress test known as your PT1. This is probably equivalent of a PPL. After you've done your PT1, then you move on to the IFR stuff. You're still on the single engine aircraft. Once you've completed everything on the single engine aircraft, you'll be on approximately about 100 hours. You then move on to the twin engine aircraft. So I did all my twin engine aircraft flying on the DA42, and I must say the DA42 is an amazing aircraft to fly. It's probably my most enjoyable bit of flight training. It was just such a smooth, nice aircraft to fly. So on the DA42, we initially started with just all the general handling stuff that we did on the single engine, but now on the twin. So now you had extra things to practice, such as engine failures, how to deal with them, and you were doing single engine circuits. And then after doing this, it was basically time for your CPL, so your commercial pilot license. So your CPL is obviously your first aviation exam, your flying exam, right? And it's quite daunting, as if you've got an external examiner coming and it's your first exam and you're getting assessed on this. However, you need to just treat it like any regular flight that you've done so many times, and you've done so many mock flights for this, so you should know and you should feel that you're ready for this. So yeah, I passed this successfully. So after completing my CPL at Leading Edge, I then moved back to L3 at Cranfield, and this was for my multi-engine instrument rating, also known as MEIR. So this was probably one of my most favourite bits of training, as we would go into the airways at roughly flight level 100, so 10,000 feet, with all the big boys. So you would hear all the call signs of all these commercial airlines, so like Easy for EasyJet, and then Speedbird for British Airways, and it was such a cool feeling just knowing that you're all like in the same vicinity as them. So for my MEIR, you basically go to different airports around the UK practicing different approaches, such as like ILSs and RNPs. So I was going all over the country, from Cornwall to Norwich, then from Bournemouth to Cardiff, for example. Now, you basically, for the exam, you basically have to demonstrate an ILS approach, an RMP approach, and one of them has to be done single engine. That is basically, after you've done your MEIR, essentially most of your flight training completed. And you've only got a few bits and bobs to go. So you've got your UPRT. UPRT is basically where they put you in these unusual attitudes, spins, deep stalls, and you basically have to recover from these attitudes and positions. And these are obviously positions that you don't want to be in real life, but in case you were in these sort of positions, you need to know how to like recover the aircraft. They put you also in like spiral dives, as well as being upside down. It's great fun, I have to say, especially if you like aerobatics. But if you're someone who doesn't have a strong stomach, it will probably make you sick. So the final bit of training is known as your APS MCC, which is known as your Airline Pilot Standards Multi-Crew Corporation. This was done for me at L3 Harris Gatwick facility. This is basically the closest feeling of becoming an airline pilot. This was my first time flying multi-crew, and this multi-crew is basically someone from your class, from your course. You're basically in the simulator with them. So for example, half the time you're acting as a captain, and half the time you're acting as a first officer, and your sim partner is in reverse to what you're doing. APS MC is approximately 3 weeks. So the first week is ground school, and the next 2 weeks is about 10 simulators. And the last simulator is basically an exam. So I did my APS MCC course on a Boeing 737. This was great fun. It was the first time where you were exposed to different failures and malfunctions. It was also the first time where we had to start thinking of how we would think in a commercial sense, how we would relay any problems to passengers, as well as ATC. So as mentioned, the 11th sim is basically the exam, and on the 11th sim, what they test you is with different malfunctions and failures, how you deal with it on a regular flight from A to B. And at the end of this, that's basically your whole of flight training done. So in March 2023, I'd finally finished with L3 Harris, and I was done with flight training. So the airline industry was still pretty down, and it still hadn't recovered from the pandemic and was not recruiting any new cadets. I was obviously quite anxious and nervous when I'd get my first job, but after a couple of months, L3 Harris got in contact with us and told us that an airline who L3 has an affiliation with is wanting to recruit new cadets from the holding pool. And as I met the requirements and the right grades, I was eligible to apply for this airliner. So as L3 Harris is a world-renowned flying school, we didn't have to actually sit any extra aptitude tests. All we had to do is basically a group exercise and an interview. I worked really, really hard for this interview as I didn't want to slip up at any stage. I started researching a lot about this airliner, started looking into, for example, who their CEO was, their history, their share prices, the different routes they do, what their strategy is, how they are different to other airliners. The interview is basically split into two parts. So you've got like the motivational side, and then you've got the scenario based. So for the motivational questions, they're basically asking, why do you want to join our airline, or what is our strategy? How can you as a pilot help the company financially, or help them save money? And like, what makes them different to other airliners? And for the scenario based questions, this is where they're asking questions like, tell me about yourself. Tell me a time you had to show leadership. Tell me a time you had to deal with conflict. Tell me a time you had to challenge a superior. Now, all my kind of experience that I've had at Stansted Airport, I was able to go back to that and make my answers from that, as well as different scenarios and examples that I was exposed to when working, when I was at L3 Harris, and the different troubles that may have come up during flight training or stuff like that. So in the interview, they expect you to follow the STAR technique. So the STAR technique is an acronym for situation, task, action and result. So by following the STAR technique, it makes sure that you structure your answer correctly, so that your answer is clear, accurate, and that you don't waffle, and that you don't end up off on a tangent. I've actually created a video, I don't know if you've watched it, on how to pass the airline interview. You can also press the link down below for that if you haven't watched that already. So thankfully, with the help of God, I was able to land a commercial airline job on an A320 4 months after I finished flight training. I was absolutely over the moon that I hadn't had to wait a very long time, and it was kind of pretty quickly after finishing flight training. So before I started for the airline, I actually had to do a type rating on A320. So for those that don't know what a type rating is basically your training on a specific aircraft. So the best way I'll put it in layman's terms is basically a driving license for a specific car. So for example, if you're flying an A320, you need to have a type rating on an A320 because you need to understand how all the systems of the aircraft work. So I started my type rating at L3 Harris, and it was good that I was going to be able to go back to the same place where I did all my flight training. I've created a massive video where it goes into a lot of detail of what comes in flight training. You can also see that video is on YouTube. So essentially, type rating is where you've got about 2 weeks of ground school, where you're learning every single system in the aircraft, how they work, as well as learning the company SOPs. There's a lot of self-study involved. This isn't really 9 to 5, this is literally 12 hours a day where you're having to do a lot of work just to cram in all this sort of information. After this, it's basically 4 weeks of simulated training where you're assessed with different scenarios, talking from engine failures to cabin depressurization to hydraulic failures. By the time you've completed all these 10 simulators, at the end you have your LST, which is known as your license skills test. If you pass your LST, which is your license skills test, you are then eligible and able to fly an A320. So after completing my type rating in December 2023, in January 2024 I started with my company, and I still had about 3 weeks of training left before I could start on the 320. So for the first week at my company, we were basically going through admin stuff, passes, IDs, getting iPads, the software that my company uses, all the different apps that we use. We were also doing like the wet drills where you go into the, where you're on the emergency slide, and then for example you go into the swimming pool and you have to put a life jacket over and you have to tread water. You have to do obviously like how to open an A320 door, fire drills. So yeah, that was initially the first week. The second and third week are simulator training. So this is basically more emergency procedures, making sure that you are at the right standard before the company release you onto the line. So after you've done all of this training, the first day you fly the aircraft is known as base training. So for those that don't know what base training is basically where you fly the aircraft for the first time, and this is without any passengers, and you've got the whole aircraft to yourself, and it's just you, a couple of captains and all your classmates that you're with. So on the day of base training, what you have to do is essentially you have to do 6 touch and go. So it's basically doing 6 circuits, you're doing a touch and go. Now this by far has to be the best day of my life so far. Just flying the jet for the first time is an incredible feeling with all of your best mates. It's something that I can't really explain. It's just an amazing feeling. So after base training, literally straight after it, you're on to line training. So line training is basically the first time where you operate as a normal airline pilot with passengers. So for my first ever flight, I went from Luton to Porto with about 180 passengers on board, and it's just a regular flight for the passengers, but for us it's a line training flight. So a line training flight is basically where you've got a first officer who's a brand new cadet on the right hand seat, and on the left hand seat you've got a line training captain. So a line training captain is a captain who's got a bit more experience and a bit more training, who's able to teach this new cadet, but as well as fly the aircraft. Now at my company, my airline, basically the first 50 sectors are line training. So after you've done your 50 sectors with a line training captain, you can then fly on the line with a regular captain. So after 50 sectors, you have something called an ACC. So this is basically where you're examined by a line training captain to see whether you can fly the aircraft safely with minimal input, and if you can fly basically from A to B in a safe manner. If you pass this exam, the next flight, which might be the next day or a couple of days after, is known as your final check. So this is where you're flying with a regular captain. He's not a line training captain, but you've got a line training captain sitting on the jump seat, and they are there just to essentially see if you can basically fly an aircraft with a regular captain without putting too much pressure onto them or making any silly, huge mistakes. If you pass this, you are then finally released onto the line with regular captains from then onwards. So that is, in a nutshell, the whole process of how to become an airline pilot. I hope you guys really enjoyed this video. I know it's been a long video with a lot of information. There's probably a lot of young aviators, aspiring pilots, who maybe now watch this video and want to now continue their dreams of becoming a pilot, but don't know where to go and need a bit of help. You can DM me, you can email me if you're now currently going through a flight school selection process. As I mentioned previously, I do one-to-one sessions and we can go through it. But no, thank you very much for watching my video. I hope you guys really enjoyed it, and hopefully I'll be able to upload another video hopefully soon. Take care, bye bye.